we're going to start on Louis Armstrong's father, Moses Willoughby Armstrong. And he was born right here on this property, somewhere close around here, because the Armstrongs who came in here and settled 5 miles east of downtown Knoxville, which would be right in here.
That looks good.
You know, when we got married in August, and Doug was renting over on Maryland Drive, the bottom of a couple house, and he worked for the train situation up off of 11W, and I don't remember their names.
Yeah.
And we got married in August, got the plans drawn, and the house started in November. So we moved back to Straw Plains Pike and stayed up in the Owl's Nest, where everybody who's ever built a house has stayed with Mother and Daddy while it was built. And then in April moved down here. And I, even back then, as young as I was, I said, I'm not moving again, just let it fall in the ground, but I'm not packing and carrying this stuff up and down the steps.
Boy, you kept your word. You stayed right here, didn't you?
No, now nobody, it's being held up from the top down.
Okie dokie. So we can start any time.
Okay. So we're going to start with Daddy's father, Louis Armstrong's father, Moses Willoughby Armstrong. And he was the son of John Armstrong and Elizabeth McMillan. And there were several brothers and sisters. And when this property was divided up, the John Armstrong was given 500 acres from his father, Aaron. And so then that 500 acres was dispensed between Papa Armstrong's sisters and his brothers. Now, I am going to say where there is a picture. There is a reunion picture of all of the brothers and sisters that is made, and we will be showing that. I've been looking and working into the maps in Knox County, and it looks like all the way from Asheville Highway to about 5 miles on south of where we're living right now, across the French Broad, there were land grants that went to the original Robert Armstrong. And this Robert Armstrong, and I'm still investigating, at one time got 3 grants of 5,000 acres each. And I'm trying to prove and get copies of those. But they obviously owned a lot of property from this Armstrong Island that is right in the middle of the Holston River, about 2 miles north of us right here, 1 mile north, was the site of the first ferry that connected this part of the country with downtown Knoxville. And it was called Ruggles Ferry, but then it was changed to Armstrong Ferry. And Papa Armstrong's grandfather, Aaron, operated and owned that ferry. And that when you went across and got on the west side of the Holston River, the road that went on downtown into the city of Knoxville had to be McCalla, because Macedonia United Methodist Church is shown on the map for that road. So I think that's interesting, because that we've always gone out Asheville Highway and Magnolia and thinking that was the main route, but it wasn't. And one thing, just for the history of it, back when these roads were being laid through here, you had a county commissioner who decided where the road was to go. But the property owners just gave their land. There was no money exchanged. And wherever the road went through their property, the owners were responsible for building that road. And they had to agree to let all males 15 to 50 get on that project and build that road as quickly as possible. And you'd build your road up to your neighbor's yard, and then they'd start and go to the next. And that's how the roads were built back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And I think that's amazing. And there, as I have said to Joe, there were lots of slaves in the Armstrong family. The Aaron had 25 slaves on one census count, and when he died, they were all willed to the children. Then they went with the 500 acres that he gave each one of his children. So it's really, that part of our life is interesting. And Aaron made the first mill of this area, was on the very tip of that Armstrong Island next to where the ferry was. And when they did build John Sevier Highway, it's recorded in Knox County Archives that they used some of those concrete discs from that mill where they had to widen the road right there to build John Sevier through. And so that's a part of the history I had no idea about. Papa Armstrong married.
Let's pause right there for just a second if we could.
Okay, Moses was a farmer, and he and his wife, Fanny Lenora Barbara Newbert, had a dairy, and they operated a dairy right out from their house. And the pictures that you'll be looking at shows the milk house is still standing. And also there are the pictures of the house back the way it looked back when Granny and Pop were living there. But now it's had, the back porch has been enclosed on it. And then there's been a screened-in porch on the west side added to it. And we can point that out in those pictures as we load them. And behind the house, Papa and Granny had a long shed, and it was divided into 3 sections. And the first largest section was a big room with a concrete floor. And I'm sure it was made with the same river rock and sand from Boyd's Creek just across the field here. And that had a drain in the center of it and a chimney that went out of it. But I don't remember the fireplace, but there had to be somewhere that they did cooking in there in large quantities with that chimney. And the next room had also a very narrow room. It wasn't more than 6 feet wide, but it had a concrete floor and shelving. And that's where they would store their canned goods during the winter time. And the last room was a dirt floor, and it was built like the letter H. It came up and then went up high, and along the top they would hang their country hams down once they'd been salt cured, and that's where they'd keep them all winter. They'd hang them right there. And they raised all of their food, because back when you think in 89 and 90 there wasn't a grocery store to go to. They raised their meat and they raised their vegetables, and they did buy flour and meal and grain for the animals and to bake with, but they really and truly had to raise everything. And they washed clothes by hand. I remember the first wringer washer that even my mother ever got, because you just did not have any of the electrical appliances at that time. And the big brass pot, Granny Armstrong did all of her cooking of applesauce and kraut and chow chow. And then during the time when hogs were killed, they'd cook the cracklings in that. And it was a major big job. You cooked and canned And sort of like they say the ants put away for the winter time, well, the humans did too at that time of their life. They had to put away. And so I was always afraid of the cows and the mules that they had, and Granny did all of the milking that I remember growing up. When I started at being born in 38, they weren't operating a dairy at that time, but they were growing all of their vegetables and still did their own milk. And you drank the milk. It wasn't pasteurized, but and they killed and raised all their hogs, all their chickens. I'd go with Granny Armstrong to get eggs every day, and it was a totally different world and life. And Moses' father, John, was also a farmer, and he tended to farm in large quantities of wheat and grain and that type of growing instead of vegetable farming. His father, Aaron, was a twin to Moses, and Aaron and Moses were born in Knox County, but several of their siblings were born in South Carolina because their father, Robert Armstrong II, was living in South Carolina, and he fought in the Revolutionary War there. He and his father, they both came from Ireland. And but Aaron lived in this area, and his brother Moses lives in the house that is right next to the River Breeze at the corner of John Sevier Highway and Asheville Highway, and that house is still standing. And I understand that up until the last 10 years, there's always been an Armstrong relative living in that house. And so then if we go to Aaron, he was very much of an industrialist. He didn't like the farming any more than my father did. And he's the one who started the ferry and working with the Ruggles, and then ended up buying it from them. And he also did the mill. And he was a very large man, and he had bright red hair. And compared to his twin brother Moses, who had dark hair and was a very small man. And Moses was a farmer, just like so many of them were, but Aaron wasn't. When Robert came from, and he was born in Ireland, and he came into this country with his father, who was also Robert, they came in through Pennsylvania and stayed for a while, and they came in with the Calhouns because Robert's mother was a sister to Patrick Calhoun, who was the grandfather of our John C. Calhoun that ended up being a vice president of the United States. And they came in and stayed for a while in Pennsylvania, but then most of the Calhouns had family already in Abbeville, South Carolina. So they all moved, then came down through the countryside and went to South Carolina. And that's where they lived, and that's where Robert II met Alice Cunningham and married her. And they had 2 children, I believe, that were born in South Carolina. But then as they came on into Tennessee, the rest of that family, Aaron and Moses and the other children, were born here. But
Can we pause here?
yes. When Robert had fought, as I said, Robert II and his father, Robert I, fought in the Revolutionary War. But they got a lot of land from land grants from the Revolutionary War. And then there was a land lobby where for 10 shillings you could buy 100 acres. And they bought a lot of land. And they obviously, the Armstrongs owned a tremendous amount of land, because later on it's recorded that Robert's son, Drury Payne, who built the Crescent Bend on the corner of Nayland Drive and Kingston Pike, had several hundred acres in that area right through there that they owned. And then his son built the Bleak House, and that turned out to be, that son had two twin girls, and Amelia, who was one of the twins, was one of Knoxville's best artists, and she has won all kind of international as well as national awards on her painting back in her day, and was considered quite famous for it. And she ended up marrying John Lutz, which was one of the old families in Knoxville, and they built on 14 acres across the road of what is now Kingston Pike in Westwood. And they had several hundred acres behind them that her father still owned. So the Robert Armstrong, he was quite involved in handling and working on land, on surveying the land in this area, and making sure that it was assigned out and people knew what their boundaries were. There is a tie-in between the Amelia Lutz and my mother, because her daughter married Victor Holloway, which was one of the upcoming best doctors that Riverside and Fort Sanders had at that time. And they built their house right next to the Amelia Holloway's house on Kingston Pike. Both of them are right in that area. And we're going back to Maxie Rimmer Armstrong, but Maxie Rimmer, as she was growing up, and we covered some of Mother's school, teaching school before. So after she taught that 1 year in school, she had all that she was going to do with teaching. She didn't like teaching the students being bigger than she was, and having the first through the 8th grade in one class was more than she had agreed to do. So she decided that she wanted to be a nurse. And Mr. Hal Harris, who was a friend of the family and was a banker in Dandridge, told Mother that he'd bring her down. He knew the people at Riverside Hospital, and get her enrolled in the program for nursing. So she came down and became a nurse. And from that nursing experience, I guess Mother found her niche in life of taking care of people, and she had a really knack of being able to take care for the sick and handle them gently. But she did a very good job and went through the Riverside program, and we've got all kind of pictures of the nurses that were at Riverside, and of the Dr. Holloway, and the different doctors that were at Riverside. And we'll have to add their description once we put the pictures in to talk about them on it. So, but after Mother had been dating and met Daddy, Louis Armstrong, and the Holloways decided that it was much more serious than they thought Mother ought to be. And they had a good connection because Dr. Holloway at the same time was dating Louise Lutz, who was Mother Amelia Armstrong Lutz, knew all of the connections of Daddy and the Armstrong family, and Daddy being a good-looking, handsome man, and he was dealing with cars and working on the cars, which were a new toy in the world at that time. He had a different girlfriend every week, and they didn't want Mother to get serious with him. So the Lute's son, Edwin, was going to go to Europe because he had married Edith Atkins, the C.B. Atkins daughter, and they were going to get a dachshund to have in their new home. And they had built their home off right next to his parents, which is called Westwood today on Kingston Pike. And so he built on the west side of the family's home. And so Dr. Holloway said that, suggested to the Edwin Lutz that Mother would be an excellent person to go on this trip to Europe with him, and that she could put Eleanor and John in bed at night, and they could be free to do whatever they wanted to, and he and his new bride. So that summer of 27, the Edwin and Louise Lutz and their daughter, John and Eleanor, who were young children, and the mother, Amelia, the artist, went with them on this trip, and they took Mother. And that was an exciting time. They went initially from here to New York and stayed a week at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York. And that was a exciting time. Mother had never been to New York City. And from there they took a ship and went into Norway, and they spent a week and a half in Norway touring the different restaurants and the different sightseeing. And from there they went on into Denmark and to Sweden, and 3 weeks later they went to Hamburg, Germany to get the little dog. And they got the puppy, and they stayed in Germany for 4 weeks. And then they went from Germany to London, England, and stayed for 3 weeks. And we'll have to talk about the restaurants and the foods and the place they saw with the pictures for me to be able to go in detail on those.
Sure.
But Mother and Daddy managed to still stay in contact, and we have a letter that is digitalized that we will read. There wasn't much separation about their not being serious, and so Mother bought her wedding dress in London, and then she bought a dress for the captain's ball on the last night on the ship coming back into New York City. And I think she had a wonderful time. Let's cut.
How long do you think she was there? How long do you think?
After they got back off of this trip, Dr. Holloway had decided that Mother would be a good person to go over and handle the nursing program at Beverly Hills Sanatorium that was just opening up for the tuberculosis patients in this area. And she was there for a couple of months and got sick. And so he brought her back, and she had tested positive for tuberculosis, but they healed it quickly and got her back. Dr. Herbert Jacobs got her on her feet, and she was doing quite good and never did go back to Beverly Hills. But she and Daddy got married on October the 14th. And so after they got married and built their house, she never did go back and work anymore on it.
What year was that?
27.
1927. You were born a year later?
Barbara was born in, they got married in 27 and Barbara was born in 29.
Okay.
And they got married in August of 27. And then Barbara was born in September of 29 and I was born in 38.
That's right, 38, not 28,
Yeah.
38.
Oh. When Mother and Daddy decided to get married, they took cousin Sid Armstrong and his wife Clara and went to Greenville, Tennessee, and were married at the Baptist church there by Reverend Jones. And I couldn't understand and I never found out why they went to Greenville to get married. Daddy had been in Sid and Clara's wedding, and there were lots of pictures made, but I've never seen a picture coming out from Mother and Daddy's wedding. And it's interesting, in the wedding announcement, we have that filmed, they got married on a Saturday afternoon, but they were in church on Sunday morning because Mother kept the program from the Sunday church service. And from there they went up into Virginia that Sunday night, and then their honeymoon went on, and they went to Washington, D.C. for a honeymoon, which in those days was a pretty major trip and a honeymoon.
But they were in church the next day.
They were.
I'm good.
Okay.
Not bad.
Papa Rimmer's family came from Person County, North Carolina, and that's just about as straight north from Chapel Hill and Raleigh as you can get. And there still is a reunion held there every July. And this last year they had over 200 Rimmers that showed up from across this country. But Papa Rimmer, his father, William, came with John, and he paid and bought 10,000 acres right in Valley View Home Road, right between Jefferson City and Dandridge. And for golfers in the family, that's exactly where the golf course is now in Dandridge. But at that time, it was all farmland. There were two sons who got the land on the east side of the creek, which was called Rimmer Creek, and two sons that got the property on the west side. And Papa Rimmer had a cantilever barn that was really unique and even was looking pretty in the mid-90s. But they had, with the barn, they had a, I'm sure it was similar to Granny Armstrong's smokehouse. And then they had an L-shaped farmhouse, which all houses seem to be built like that. And the pictures that we have of it shows the original drawing of the first house. And on the fireplace, they put the date of their wedding, which was in 1858. And that was carved in on the fireplace. But and my experience at that house was when Papa Rimmer's next to the youngest son, Fred, was sick in Morristown, and we were taking Aunt Jeanette over to Dandridge for changes of clothes. We went by there, and Mother said, "That's where I grew up." And in fact, this picture of her shows her sitting on the bridge with her older sister, Love, at that same house. And we stopped and went in and around and looked in the house. And at that time it was all boarded up, but we were looking in. And to get into it, we should have been wiser. There was an electric fence we had to crawl under. And it was hard getting Mother underneath that electric fence, but Jeanette and I did it. And we were walking around and went through the barn and back at the back of the house, and we saw the biggest cows you've ever seen coming at us. And it didn't take Mother 2 seconds to go under that fence, and she was at the car before we were. But these pictures were all made at that time when we were there. Then Papa Bremer, when they sold the farm and they were going to move into Dandridge, they moved up on what's called Circle Drive, which overlooks the Douglas Lake, right at the point of the bridge that goes across in Dandridge. And they had the last house on that hill on the west side of Circle Drive going through there. And it was a house with 3 bedrooms on the right side. As you went in, there was a hall that went from the front porch to the back porch. And you had 3 bedrooms on the right and 2 bedrooms and a parlor on the left. And the parlor had a large pot-bellied stove that they heated that side of it. I didn't think at the time, but I don't know how they heated the 3 sides where the other 3 bedrooms were. But considering they had 9 children, I'm sure everybody stayed warm. And then they had a kitchen, and Granny Bremer had a huge stove with 2 ovens, a warming oven and a cooking oven, and it was all heated with coal. And it had been a wood-burning stove, and Papa Bremer had converted it over to be able to cook on coal with it. And they still had the land out on Valley View and did farm that land. And during harvest time, Mother said that Granny Bremer, by noon and at the end of the day, she'd have maybe 15 or 20 men that had worked the fields that would come home with Papa to eat that night, plus having 9 little children to feed. So she had to be a pretty strong person, even though she was barely 5 feet tall on it. And their children that we want to talk about some in this because they're very important. The first child was Elsie Love, and she married Bonnie Carmichael, and they lived in Newport. And Bonnie went by the name of Ellick, so Uncle Ellick was with Merchant Planters Bank, and Aunt Love taught at the Newport Grammar School, the 4th grade, until she retired from there. And Uncle Ellick and Daddy were strong fishing partners. They enjoyed going out on the lake and fishing, and every day, every Sunday they could get there. That's where they'd want to do. So we spent a lot of time with Love and Ellick, either in Newport or in Knoxville. And Love and Ellick had 1 daughter, Jean Walker, and she married Joe Kerr Walker, and they lived in Greenback, and then later years moved into Maryville, and had 2 children, Pat and mine. Then Mother came along, and after Mother, Ralph came along, and Ralph ended up going with Granny Bremer's brother to Bremerton, Washington, and he grew up out there and married a lady, Alice Fowler, one of the triplets. And triplets that lived back in those days she was in the paper quite often about being a triplet. But they had 1 daughter, Joan. And then after Ralph, Emma Sue was born. And Emma Sue had 3 children, Jane and Bobby and Eddie died as an infant. Jane grew up and married Bill Fair, a radiologist, and they lived most of their life in Nashville. And they had 3 children, Lynn Ann and Cindy and Steve. And Bobby he married, but he only had 1 son, and it wasn't a happy marriage, and the son, I think, eventually was adopted by another man. And then after Emma Sue came Ray, and Ray married a girl from Dandridge, Lucy Feltner, and they had Elsie Jane. And Elsie Jane and the Jane that we just talked about and myself were good buddies. I was younger than they were, but I was close enough that they would play with me when we went to Dandridge, so we had a bond that got created. And Elsie Jane...
Can we pause right there just for a second?
Okay. After Ray, Helen was born. And Helen was the largest of Granny Rimmer's children. She was very tall and a large lady, and she married Earl Asher, and they lived in Oak Ridge. And they had 3 sons, Sammy and David and Ken. And Sammy was as tall as his mother. And in this picture with Joe, you can just see what the difference in their sizes were. Because all of the other siblings, the girls were all barely 5 feet tall, if they were 5 feet tall. But the boys were all tall. And Helen was tall like a boy. Sammy was killed in the Vietnam War. He was leading went into the Green Berets, and they were in a battle, and all of his men got out alive, and he got them safe, but he went back and got killed at that. Ken is working at the University of Arizona, and David is a councilman in Bremerton, Washington. So they've spread out and gone all around. Then we had Sarah, and Sarah lived with us the big part of our life. She was there when I was little nearly all the time. And even when my daughter was born, Maxie, and Sarah and Mother and I did a lot of things together, and Maxie was close to Sarah. She married Buster Charles Hollingsworth and had one daughter, Sarah Lynn, who married Mike Gillum and lives in Nashville and has 2 sons. And after Sarah, Fred was next in line, and Fred got married right before he was signed up for World War II. He was the only one of Granny Rimmer's sons not drafted. Fred volunteered. Jack and Ray were drafted, and Ralph was working for the Navy already in Bremerton, so he stayed where he was. But Fred ended up marrying a girl he dated a little bit right before he got shipped out in World War II. And when he came back, they got divorced immediately. And they had a little girl, Jeannie, which he gave up for adoption because Agnes had remarried later on, and the man wanted to adopt Jeannie. But then Fred, with Daddy helping him and working with Daddy, he ended up getting his degree from UT in business. And he met Jeanette Grace Dean, and somehow he married Jeanette, and she was a volunteer beauty. She was a torchbearer. She had a 4.0 average. And why she ever dated Fred, I don't know, except she always said he was the cutest little boy she'd ever seen. So Fred and Jeanette got married in Louisville, and they came back, spent their honeymoon in the Owl's Nest at Mother's house, and then Fred remodeled and put a bathroom in up at Granny Armstrong's house, and they lived there until Steve was 6 and Jerry was 2, and then they built their home in Dandridge, and Bill was born after that. And Jack was the next in line, and Jack married Ruth French, and as we've talked about, he worked for Daddy and directed the body school during the VA. And he and Ruth had 2 sons, Johnny and Tom, and they both lived in Dandridge. And that's those 9 siblings. Sure. Papa Ann's mother was Sarah Ann Miller. And at the time, when they were all growing up, Greene County went down into Jefferson County. And in fact, Jefferson County sort of came out of Greene County, and then Jefferson County had to give up part of their land to Hawkins and Hamlin County. So the Miller family, the Sarah Ann Miller's mother was a Morse, Gideon Morris's daughter, and the Abram Miller, her father, their land and all of this adjusting of the counties ended up while they were in Jefferson County in some senses. The next year they were in Hamlin County, but they didn't move. It was the same property. And Gideon Morris was a Revolutionary War soldier also, as was the Abram Miller. And the Morse family is the family that goes back, married the Crows up in Morristown, that I had a lot of, and that's where we get some of our Indian genes, I'm sure, although it's so far back, it doesn't allow us to make any claims on the gambling casinos that are set up for the Cherokees, but at least I know that's where these chinky pin eyes and the hair that some of the rumor girls particularly have had. But Morses gave the land off of their farmland to form the city of Morristown, and that's where Morristown was started from, was from the Morse farm. When I started at school, I went to Ramsey School. I'm one of these people who none of my schools that I went to is still standing. Ramsey property was the county. When they closed the school, they tore it down and made a park out of it. In Ramsey School, went from the 1st to the 8th grade. And the 1st through the 3rd, I never went to school enough to have a report card because I always had bronchitis and was sick. And every year, Mildred Doyle, the superintendent, would get Ms. Lucille Burkhart to give me a test to see if I could be passed from what Mother had taught me to the next grade without going to school. But by the 4th grade, I got to where I was not having as much asthma, and we had a new allergist in town, and it got to be fun to go to school. In the 5th grade, my most exciting year was the year Barbara and George got married. And so they got married May the 14th, and school wasn't out till the 30th, and I got out of school almost the full 2 weeks before the wedding. And that was the most exciting thing that had ever happened or been around. So and after they got married, we made our first trip that summer that I'd ever been out of the state of Tennessee to go to Daytona Beach. And I'll take that back. The 6 months before they got married, Fred and Jeanette got married, and I got to go to Louisville to their wedding. But we drove up that morning, they had the wedding, and we drove back that night. So I really didn't see anything of Louisville. But it was pretty, and I remember there had been a lot of flooding, and we saw lots of water standing in the houses still with water in them on that old 2-lane road going to Louisville. But we got to go to Daytona, and that was the first time I had ever seen the ocean. And that was an exciting time. When I finished the 8th grade at Ramsey, I was the only black sheep that didn't go to Central High School. And we had a Mr. Sam Kennedy that lived right within a mile of our house that taught science at Young. And at that time in life, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And so Mother would take me down to this Coel grocery store every morning, and I would stand by a big old pot-bellied furnace in the wintertime until Mr. Kennedy pulled out of the yard and over to the store, and then I would ride with him to Young High and back. That was an exciting time. And at Young, we've talked about being in the band already, but my other interest at Young was in science. And there was a Dr. J.T. Johnson that taught after the general science was Mr. Kennedy, and Dr. Johnson taught chemistry and physics and biology. And so I had him for 3 years, and he got me working on little science projects, and I published the first little paper I ever wrote on water molds of Knox County that we cultivated and grew penicillin out of from the water out over in this Blake Creek and the mold that came out of that. And then my senior year, we had continued that project and really had proof of an antibiotic in it, and I got to go to the International Science Fair, which was just a national fair back in the 50s, and we went to Oklahoma City. And Young and when the Science Academy here in Knoxville gave us $100 for winning, plus $250 scholarship. So there wasn't any flying in 56 to Oklahoma City. So Daddy took off from work, and Mother and Daddy drove Doc Johnson and me to Oklahoma. And, nylons and that type, Chemstrand Corporation was just in their earliest days back in 56. And Doc Johnson's brother-in-law was head of the Chemstrand plant in Huntsville, Alabama. So he directed Daddy to Oklahoma City by way of going and spending 2 nights in Huntsville so I could go through the Chemstrand plant and see all of that. And then we got on out to Oklahoma City and had the science fair. And I got an honorable mentioning in that group. But it was the most fun, the friends we met and the people, some of them, and one in particular I'm still friends with. So that was a really great thing. And then...
Can you tell us more about what Chemstrand is?
Chemstrand was the company that took and made the first nylons that were ever used in material. And you saw it from the chemical big vats all the way to the finished nylon product. And it was a growth out of World War II, a discovery from that time. I need a break.
So that was... Well, that's amazing, though, that that's this part of the story is where you got your interest in science.
Right.
And from taking water samples out of a creek around here, and then you ended up in Oklahoma, went honorable mention, and then got a career out of it. And it was one teacher that inspired you.
He did. I really basically, till Mother and Daddy said I couldn't take my car with me, wanted to go to Memphis and the year I would have gone, there was one other female in med school. My Sunday school teacher, Charles Winter, was in that class, and he said that they had one girl in the whole class.
But you went into the sciences side of it instead of
I went into the lab end of it.
Interesting. So what happened when you came back from Oklahoma? How did this keep evolving? What happened next?
Alrighty. When we got back from Oklahoma and I graduated from Young, I had a scholarship to UT. And my $250 scholarship paid 5 quarters of tuition because it was $50 a quarter when I was going to UT. And I don't remember about books, but I know that I went through and I got my credits to go to med school because I was working towards going still I wanted to be a physician. And in between my freshman and sophomore year at UT, Mother decided I needed more on-hands experience. So that summer, she knew Mrs. Killiford, who was head of the nursing program at Fort Sanders. She had been at Riverside, and Miss Killiford was still at Fort Sanders. And she called her and she said, "Can you get Tommye something to do, hopefully in the lab, during the summertime, just to do it. Anything she can do that might help them, not for money." And so I worked and made media in the micro department at Fort Sanders all summer between my freshman and sophomore year. And back then, you still had a lot of tuberculosis in this area. And Fort Sanders and Children's had a joint project to where they made all the tuberculin media for every hospital in this town. And for 4 straight days, Saturday and Sunday included, you cracked eggs, and because it was the basis of the media was eggs. And we went through dozens, crates upon eggs, and we would make like 2,000 tubes of tuberculin media. And back in the 50s, that did a lot of testing for around here. And I got to know Richard Lee and Dr. Ralph Monger, who had been a young doctor that came into Riverside when Mother was there, was the pathologist at Fort Sanders. And I really had a good time in that. And the blood bank technician at Fort Sanders was Miss Beth Money. And her father had been the administrator at one time when Mother was working, when Riverside merged with Fort Sanders, and Mother ended up at Fort Sanders. Mr. Money was the administrator. So there was tie-ins to her background and her friends she knew, and I enjoyed that to no end. So I did my sophomore year and had enough credits to apply to go to Memphis. But when I graduated from Young, Mother and Daddy had given me a red and white hardtop Bel Air convertible. And although they had to make me learn to drive it, it sat in the garage for about 4 months before I ever started it. Once I did, I really loved it. And Mother said, "Well, you can't take the car with you. You don't need a car in Memphis." And so we fooled around, and I found out, and Dr. Monger had told me too, that there was a medical technology program that UT was affiliated with St. Mary's, and I could finish one more year at UT and then go to St. Mary's for 12 months and graduate that way. So, all things considered, that's what I ended up doing. And I graduated from St. Mary's in '60, and then got my UT degree the following fall. They waited for 12 months. Not 12 months, the next semester. St. Mary's graduation was 2 weeks after UT spring graduation, so I didn't get through until the fall. But that last year that I was at St. Mary's is when Major Riba had started working to get me in the band at UT. And so, even though I had graduated, I went back and for 2 years, every fall quarter, took Psychology 101 and the next year 102, and marched with the Pride of Southland Band and played with them. And after I graduated from St. Mary's, I went back to Fort Sanders and worked in their chemistry lab for almost 6 months. And Dr. Virgine Overholt had a really top independent private lab in this town with his cardiac practice. And I had got to know Dr. Overholt while I was at St. Mary's. Plus, I knew his two sons, Bob and Gene, because we were all in class together at UT. And had lots of classes with each other. So finally, Dr. Overholt made me an offer, and I left Fort Sanders and headed up his lab. And we instituted, he liked doing new things, and so we instituted the first labs in Knoxville that were doing what was called a PBI, a protein-bound iodine, for people with thyroid disease. He sent me to some classes to learn how to do that, and I brought him back and set it up. And then there was a Dr. Felix Wroblewski in New York at Sloan Kettering had developed a new procedure to determine if your cardiac heart attack was caused by a missing enzyme. And Dr. Overholt sent me there, and I brought that procedure back and set it up. So we had one of the top labs around.
Now we talk more about, you want to talk more about the lab?
The lab at Overholt's was recognized by all of the pathologists around, and at that time you could get the American College of Clinical Pathologists to send you unknown samples every month, and you never knew what they were going to be for, but you had to ask them for whatever tests they ordered and send the results back, and we stayed certified the whole time I was there. But Dr. Overholt got very mad when I decided to get married. And he and I split ways on my wedding day because he called about an hour before I was getting married and told me I couldn't come back to work. And so we didn't end up very good friends at all. But anyway, after Doug and I got married, I went to work at the University Research Center. That is at UT Memorial Hospital, but the research center was a separate wing from there. And I went to work for Dr. Alan Solomon, and that's where I learned all of my basic immunology and all of the studies of antigens and antibodies and how to do what has led on to the last 40 years of work. Cut.